Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalkwist, and we're looking at the stories by which we deeply live. There's a common saying in psychotherapy circles when the topic of why don't we leave difficult situations comes up. And I'm thinking of situations where it could be at work, could be in a relationship, putting up with a family member who abuses us, situations that are difficult where we really do have the option of walking away, but we don't. And this also comes up frequently in couples counseling. Why do I keep going back to the same kinds of controlling partner or covert narcissist or whoever it is? And so in therapy circles, what's often said is you keep doing that because it's familiar, which is no explanation whatsoever. There's a lot of things that are familiar that we would drop instantly if we could. People don't suffer from chronic pain because it's familiar. If they had an opportunity to turn it off, they would do it in a heartbeat. And one can immediately think of dozens of other examples. So this explanation, so-called, of it's familiar, it's just lazy thinking. It's just repeating what other people have said about this. So we're going to dispense with it, and we're going to talk about why it's really difficult to undergo these major life transitions, even when we have the choice to. Why is it so hard? Why so often do we pick staying stuck, even when it makes us miserable, to moving forward? Another explanation that's often cited is we're afraid of change, which makes a little bit more sense than it's familiar. But change happens every day. Every single day is different than the one before it. So it's probably not enough that it's fear of change. It seems more correct to say that it's fear of multiple changes all at the same time, especially when it's a big life transition. And added into the mix, and this is probably the core of it, is that what we're actually facing is a change in our identity, and that's what makes it scary. When we move forward in ways that require that we show up as a different person, we're not just leaving one or two things behind, we're leaving an entire self behind. And that's hard. To change identities not only thrusts us into all of our insecurities about how we show up in the world and to ourselves, to other people, to those who are close to us, but it highlights all the different areas of a life that may or may not have to change too. When you see yourself differently, sometimes your entire career is now up for grabs. And the longer you've been in it, the harder it is to face. I've been through this a couple of times. For 9 years, I thought of myself primarily as a psychotherapist. And then I didn't. And that was pretty scary. I thought it was something I could depend on, thinking of myself that way. It wasn't. I've thought of myself as primarily a professor and graduate educator, and now that's up for grabs. So career is a big deal to some of us, not so much to others. But when we have to show up with a different identity, it's not just career that might be up for grabs, it might be people too. There are friends who will be there for you on the other side of the transition, and there are friends who won't. They like the old you better. Same thing with relationship partners. Same thing with family members. A friend of mine recently went through a relationship breakup with somebody who, according to her, and this is a recent learning for her, probably suffers from covert narcissism. And as soon as she broke up with him, he got busy going around to all her friends and colleagues and very cleverly painting a picture of her as extremely unstable, deceitful, hypocritical, but making it all seem like it was her fault and he was the victim. I think a lot of us have been through this. I have been. It can not only lose you friends, but also colleagues. It can affect you professionally. It can harm your reputation. There's all this damage control that needs to be done. But sometimes deep change, life identity change, doesn't involve that, although it can involve setting boundaries. It could be that there's somebody in your life who is more or less gotten used to emotionally abusing you down the decades, and then you hold your hand up and say, this is going to stop. I'm not going to put up with this anymore. And that's a big change. Also, change can affect where you are located geographically. I've lived my whole life in California. I was born here. And because of the nature of changes I'm going through, I don't know if I'm going to stay. I don't know if I can continue to think of myself as a Californian. Maybe I will. Maybe I will stay here. But that's up for grabs. And it's not just a matter of a geographical transition. It's a matter of a whole set of relationships we have, whether we're conscious of them or not, with these places that have held and sustained us, even if they've also given us a difficult time. So there's that kind of change too. And then there's the change of day-to-day life habits. Maybe you don't sleep the way that you used to because of whatever the shift is that happened. Maybe if you have an exercise routine, maybe it totally transforms. Maybe your entire daily schedule is out of whack now. So all that gets disrupted as well. And then there's changes in your spirituality. And contrary to some opinions, we all have spirituality, broadly defined. We're spiritual people at the core, whether or not we call any religion home. And so right now, by the poll numbers, record numbers of people in this country, the U.S., are dropping out of membership in organized religions. They're tired of them being mixed with politics. Some people are tired of the whole patriarchal top-down authority thing. And it takes courage to drop out of something like that, because then what? There's no easily available alternative that's popular. And of course, when you drop out of a religion, oftentimes you're dropping out of a community as well. And that has lots of repercussions. Now, notice that whether they're welcome or painful, all of these kinds of changes mean loss. And loss usually means some kind of grief. So in entering into deep lifestyle change, you're also entering into grief of all those losses. There's a card from the tarot deck, the Rider-Waite deck, which ought to be called the Pamela Coleman Smith deck. Anyway, it's the most popular style of tarot art. It depicts a sad-looking man with some cups that are spilled in front of him, and there are some cups behind him waiting to be picked up. And his head is tilted to the side. You can't see his face, but the whole mood of the card is sad. And I sometimes think of that card when we go through losses. There are things that need to get left behind. There's another cup card from the Cup Suite, where a man is leaving behind a whole stack of cups that had previously been put carefully together, and now he's leaving. So there's grieving or mourning to get through as well in big transitions, even when they're for the better. My impression is that something in us unconsciously knows when those sorts of losses are on the horizon. And there's an idea that evolved in the clinical practice of the psychoanalyst Karen Horney. She talked about what she called secondary defenses. So, unconsciously, when we are vulnerable somewhere, we deploy defenses, in other words, maneuvers to protect ourselves from anything that might touch those vulnerable spots. And so, one example would be the whole idea of the unconscious, which some people guard against because there's so much going on in theirs. And so, I think secondary defenses sometimes come into play when we sense that there's an opportunity or a person or an event that could be a trigger for this kind of big lifestyle change, and we avoid it because perhaps we feel we're not ready. But there's something about the human psyche that's more than just the psyche inside of us. Because when these big changes come down the pike, there's a way in which all of our internal organization cooperates with the change, even when we fight it, while factors line up on the outside that echo the change. So it feels like things are changing inwardly and outwardly. And I think that's one of the indicators of one of these big developmental shifts, these big changes, where it's identity itself that changes. Many years ago, when I made the transition from being a young technical writer hired right out of college into psychotherapy as a career, something that extended over a few years, because of course I had to go to school and get trained and then internship and all that. There were a number of losses that took place, starting with the daily round at work. No more of that. Which, of course, in some ways was a relief because it was a very abusive workplace. But even so, it was jarring. It was disorienting. I remember for a good year or two, I felt guilty. It was a conditioned feeling of guilt that I wasn't getting in my car and commuting in the morning and coming back in the late afternoon like millions of other people were doing. That whole schedule went out the window. So I had to reorganize what I did during the day. When am I going to work? What time am I going to get up? And a lot of my work friends went away. Not all of them, but a lot. There were people I saw every day that I never saw again. My schedule shifted for the better, of course, because 2 hours of commute were knocked out of it. And then I had a whole series of new friends and colleagues to meet and get to know. That was a whole set of changes. And instead of thinking of myself as somebody who perhaps would have moved up the corporate hierarchy in one fashion or another, now I was starting to think of myself as a psychotherapist in training. And there were many other changes too. I was treated differently by family and some of my friends. Some family and friends thought I was nuts for giving up a supposedly secure job in the corporate world that I knew how to do really well. They thought that until 6 months after I left, the entire operation was closed down and all of my colleagues were laid off. So much for job security. So at this point, I think there's a guiding figure from folklore who can help us with this. Many of us have heard of the fabulous phoenix, the bird, the magical bird, who has counterparts in many different cultures: China, Africa, African cultures, other parts of the world. There are stories of Thunderbird on this continent, so many different forms. And as we've often heard, this bird builds its own nest at one point at the end of its life cycle and sets it on fire and burns up with it. And then a new phoenix, a new identity, rises from the ashes of the burned up nest, and the bird is rejuvenated. I look at all of it as a mythic playing out of the archetype of resurrection. The old dies so that the new can rise. And the last act of the old is to set its nest on fire. Now, bearing in mind that we often do things symbolically and unconsciously, maybe that's what we're doing to the planet. It's time for us collectively to abandon old attitudes, old rituals, old ways of doing things, old values, old relationships, and move forward into the next stage of our maturity as a species. It's time to burn up the nest. Instead, we're doing it unconsciously and literally. Wildfires in many parts of the world now, including here in California. It's all unconscious phoenix work, it seems to me. We're burning up the wrong nest. The one we should be burning up is the one on the inside, so that we can act differently and show up differently on the outside. So as a result, a lot of these old institutions, including fossil fuel energy production, remain in effect while the world burns. It reminds me a little bit of some people, not all, who commit suicide because there's something in them that needs to die, but they're afraid of facing up to what that is, so they kill themselves instead. They literalize what should be an internal process as part of their individuation. Seems to be what we're doing to the world as well. So the advice I would leave you with is when you get into situations where the norm feels either stuck and barren or actively painful, to consider the option of setting your nest on fire. Maybe it's time to show up as a new self, with a new set of relationships, a new identity, a new outlook on the world, and many new paths, spiritual or otherwise. I've noticed too in myself and in other people that often when a nest needs to burn so the phoenix can rise, sometimes there's a call to creativity of some sort. And creativity, of course, doesn't belong just to artists or filmmakers, sculptors or dancers, writers. It's something that we all do. So if you find yourself in a time where perhaps you should ignite the nest, a question that can go along with this is, what form does my creativity want to take in the next phase of my life? When I started writing fiction novels a couple of years ago, and then fiction stories before that, I got the idea to sit down and sketch some of the characters. And I hadn't sketched anything since I was a kid. So I didn't know what would happen. And I was stunned by how well they turned out. I'm no professional artist, but I looked at the pictures I drew of some of the characters and I went, wow, this is really good. So I kept at it. But creativity can take an infinite number of forms. Maybe it looks like, for you, innovation, or maybe it looks like some sort of craft work or a retelling of your story. There's many ways that creativity can come into this. The flight of the phoenix is itself an act of creativity, because something new is being created and it's taking flight. When the old dies, something bird-like comes along and grows wings, and then you're off. So yes, change at that level can be very painful and fill you with uncertainty. But it can also be exciting and a challenge and an open door into new landscapes and new skies. So when you ignite the nest, also remember to enjoy what's going to happen. Thank you.